Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of the New Orleans Saints bounty scandal. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are stories that settle into the bones of a city like sediment in a riverbed, layer upon layer, until they become part of the very foundation upon which everything else is built. In New Orleans, where the Mississippi carries secrets from 1,000 miles upstream and deposits them in the Delta mud, where jazz was born in the spaces between notes and Mardi Gras masks hide truths as much as they reveal them, there lived a football team that carried the dreams of a drowning city on their shoulders. The year was 2005, and Hurricane Katrina had torn through New Orleans like a biblical reckoning, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the end of the world. The water had receded, but the scars remained. In the abandoned houses with their spray-painted X's marking the dead, in the empty lots where homes once stood, in the eyes of people who had lost everything but somehow found the strength to stay. Into this wounded city came a football team that had never known glory, a franchise that had spent 4 decades collecting losses like some people collect coins, each defeat another small weight in their pockets. The New Orleans Saints had been, for most of their existence, a kind of beautiful tragedy. They were the team that found new ways to break your heart. The team that could snatch defeat from the jaws of victory with an artistry that was almost impressive in its consistency. But something was different now, in this post-Katrina world where survival itself had become an act of defiance. The city needed heroes, and perhaps more than that, it needed to believe that resurrection was possible. Sean Payton arrived in New Orleans in 2006 like a man carrying blueprints for a cathedral in a city of ruins. He was young for a head coach, with the kind of intense energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of his skin. His eyes held the focused gleam of someone who had studied the game not just as a series of plays and formations, but as a living, breathing organism that could be understood, manipulated, coaxed into revealing its secrets. He brought with him a quarterback named Drew Brees, a man whose right shoulder had been shattered the year before, whose arm had been questioned, whose career had been whispered to be over before it truly began. Brees came to New Orleans not as a conquering hero, but as a wounded pilgrim, seeking redemption in a city that understood the weight of broken dreams. His shoulder bore the surgical scars of reconstruction, pink lines on pale skin that told the story of metal plates and borrowed time. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet certainty, a stillness at the center that suggested he knew secrets about perseverance that most people never learn. When he threw a football, you could see the careful calculation in every motion, the way he had rebuilt his delivery from the ground up, accounting for what was lost and amplifying what remained. The defense that Payton and his coordinators assembled was built on a different philosophy entirely. While the offense would be surgical, precise, a scalpel cutting through the soft tissue of opposing secondaries, the defense would be a sledgehammer. They would hit hard and hit often, turning the act of tackling into something approaching performance art. This was football in its most primal form, where the goal was not just to stop the opposing team, but to make them remember the experience long after the game was over. Into this defensive philosophy walked Greg Williams, a man whose very name seemed to carry the weight of old-school football wisdom. Williams had coached defense across the National Football League for years, building his reputation on the simple premise that football was, at its core, a collision sport. and the team that collided harder would usually walk away victorious. He was not a large man physically, but there was something in his presence that filled rooms, a gravitational pull that drew players into his orbit and held them there. When he spoke about defense, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen every possible way a play could unfold and had prepared for all of them. Williams understood that defense was not just about stopping plays, it was about creating doubt. It was about making the quarterback's internal clock run a little faster, making the running back hesitate for a split second at the line of scrimmage, making receivers wonder if catching a pass over the middle was really worth the inevitable collision that would follow. Fear, he knew, was a tool as valuable as any X's and O's drawn on a whiteboard. And in the NFL, where the margins between victory and defeat were often measured in fractions of seconds and single yards, psychological warfare was not just acceptable. It was essential. The culture that developed within the Saints' defense was intense, almost tribal in its closeness. These were men who had chosen to make their living by controlled violence, who understood that every Sunday they would line up across from other men whose job was to run through them, around them, over them if necessary. In such an environment, toughness was not just valued, it was the only currency that mattered. Players who could deliver punishment and absorb it with equal stoicism were elevated to something approaching folk hero status. Those who showed hesitation, who pulled up short on tackles or avoided contact, found themselves on the outside of the circle, looking in at a brotherhood they could observe but never truly join. The Saints' locker room became a place where stories of hits were told and retold like epic poems, where particularly devastating tackles were dissected and analyzed frame by frame. Players would gather around grainy video footage, pointing out the precise moment of impact, the way a receiver's knees buckled, or a running back's forward progress was not just stopped, but reversed. There was an art to it, they believed, a craft that could be perfected through study and practice. The goal was not simply to tackle. Any player in the league could wrap up and bring down a ball carrier. The goal was to deliver hits that would echo, that would be remembered, that would change the way an opponent thought about coming into their territory. Williams cultivated this culture carefully, like a gardener tending to rare and dangerous flowers. He understood that the line between aggressive and reckless was thin, that crossing it could result in penalties, injuries, and the kind of reputation that officials would watch for and punish. But he also knew that in a league where every team was populated by world-class athletes, where the physical differences between players were often minimal, the team that could establish psychological dominance would hold a crucial advantage. The concept of bounties, cash payments for particularly effective hits, emerged from this culture gradually, naturally, like a river changing course over time. It was never formally announced, never written down in team manuals or discussed in official meetings. Instead, it grew in the spaces between official team activities, in the conversations that happened in hotel lobbies during road trips, in the parking lot after practice when players lingered by their cars, reluctant to let the day end. The system, as it developed, was elegantly simple in its brutality. Players would contribute money to a pool, with coaching staff sometimes adding to the fund. This money would then be distributed as rewards for what were euphemistically called impact plays. Hits that knocked opposing players out of the game, interceptions that stopped drives, fumbles forced at crucial moments. The amounts were not enormous by NFL standards, a few $100 or $1,000, pocket change for men making millions. But the money was never really the point. The money was just a way of keeping score, a tangible representation of the intangible respect that players earned through their willingness to sacrifice their bodies for the team. What made the system particularly insidious was how it normalized and incentivized behavior that existed in the gray areas of football's moral landscape. Every defensive player in the NFL is trying to hit hard. Every tackle is an attempt to separate a player from the ball and, ideally, from his senses, at least temporarily. The line between a clean, devastating hit and a dirty play is often subjective, visible only in slow-motion replay, and even then open to interpretation. By placing a monetary value on impact plays, the Saints created a system where players were encouraged to push right up to that line, and perhaps occasionally step over it. The culture that developed was one of selective blindness. Players knew the system existed, participated in it willingly, but also maintained a kind of plausible deniability about its more troubling implications. They would speak in code, referring to getting our money's worth, or making sure opposing players remembered where they were. The language was carefully chosen to sound like typical football motivation, while carrying darker undertones for those who understood the context. Jonathan Vilma, the Saints linebacker who had arrived from the New York Jets in 2008, became one of the system's most enthusiastic participants. Vilma was not the largest linebacker in the league, but he possessed an intelligence and instinct for the game that allowed him to diagnose plays before they developed, and position himself to make maximum impact. He understood football as a chess match played at superhuman speed, where the ability to read and react a split second faster than your opponent could mean the difference between a tackle and a knockout blow. Vilma's leadership within the defense was quiet but unmistakable. Younger players watched how he carried himself, how he prepared for games, how he celebrated big hits. When he endorsed the bounty system, when he contributed money to the pool and encouraged others to do the same, it carried weight because of the respect he had earned through his play. He was not just advocating for harder hits, he was advocating for a philosophy of defense that prioritized intimidation as much as technique. The effects of this culture were visible every Sunday in the Superdome, that cavernous concrete cathedral where the Saints played their home games. The Superdome itself carried emotional weight for the city, having served as a shelter of last resort during Hurricane Katrina, where thousands of New Orleans residents had waited in increasingly desperate conditions for rescue that seemed like it might never come. The building had been transformed from a place of despair into a fortress of hope, where 70,000 voices would rise as one, creating a wall of sound that visiting teams claimed they could feel in their chest cavities. When the Saints' defense took the field in the Superdome, they carried with them the knowledge that they were not just representing a team, but an entire city's will to survive and thrive. The crowd's energy fed into their own, creating a feedback loop where each big hit was amplified by the roar of approval from the stands, where each defensive stop felt like a small victory for everyone who had stayed, who had rebuilt, who had refused to let catastrophe be the final word in their story. The hits became legendary, talked about not just by Saints fans but by football fans across the country who appreciated the artistry of perfectly timed violence. There was something almost balletic about the way Saints defenders would converge on ball carriers, the way they would time their arrivals to create maximum impact while still remaining within the technical boundaries of legal play. Opposing teams began to game plan specifically for the Saints' aggressive style, warning their skill position players to expect harder hits than usual, and to be prepared for contact that might come slightly later than expected, in the gray area after a play was technically over, but before the whistle had blown. The success of this approach was undeniable. The Saints, who had been mediocre for so long that mediocrity had become their defining characteristic, suddenly found themselves competitive with the league's elite teams. Their defense, anchored by players who seemed to take personal offense at every yard gained by their opponents, became one of the most feared units in the NFL. More importantly, for a city still healing from trauma, they became a source of pride, a reason to believe that New Orleans could be great at something again. The 2009 season unfolded like a dream that New Orleans had been afraid to dream. The Saints, led by Breeze's increasingly precise passing and a defense that seemed to grow more aggressive with each game, began winning not just games, but souls. Each victory felt like vindication, proof that the city's faith had been justified, that the years of suffering had been a kind of investment that was finally paying dividends. The playoff run was particularly sweet because it came against teams that embodied everything New Orleans was not. They faced the Philadelphia Eagles, a city known for its toughness but not its poetry. They faced the Minnesota Vikings, representatives of a harsh, unforgiving climate so different from New Orleans's humid, sensual atmosphere. And in each game, the Saints found ways to win that seemed almost scripted, as if the football gods had finally decided that this city, this team, this group of players deserved their moment. The NFC Championship game against the Minnesota Vikings was played in conditions that seemed designed to test the Saints' resolve. The Superdome, usually a controlled environment where temperature and wind were non-factors, became a cauldron of noise and tension. The Vikings, led by the legendary Brett Favre, had their own compelling narrative, the aging quarterback's quest for one final moment of glory. But the Saints' defense, motivated by their bounty system and the intoxicating possibility of playing for a Super Bowl championship, rose to the occasion. The hits in that game were particularly vicious, even by the Saints' elevated standards. Vikings receivers found themselves on the wrong end of collisions that left them slow to get up, that had them looking over their shoulders on subsequent plays. Favre, the gunslinger who had made a career of standing in the pocket and delivering passes in the face of onrushing defenders, found himself under pressure that seemed to come from every direction at once. The Saints' defensive players, knowing that this might be their only chance to play for a championship, channeled years of frustration and hunger into every tackle, every hit, every moment of contact. When the Saints finally won, when they secured their trip to Super Bowl 44, the celebration that erupted in New Orleans was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. This was not just about football. This was about redemption, about proving that a place written off as irrelevant could rise again and demand the world's attention. The streets filled with people who had stayed when others left, who had rebuilt when others moved away, who had believed when others gave up hope. Super Bowl 44, played in Miami against the Indianapolis Colts, was the culmination of everything the Saints had been building toward. The Colts were led by Peyton Manning, the cerebral quarterback whose preparation and precision represented the opposite of the Saints' more emotional, aggressive approach. The game itself was a masterpiece of tension, with momentum shifting back and forth like a tide. But it was the Saints who found a way to win, who made the crucial plays when they mattered most. When Tracy Porter intercepted Manning's pass and returned it for a touchdown, when the clock finally ran down and the confetti began to fall, it felt like more than just a football victory. It felt like proof that some stories, no matter how unlikely they seem, are destined to have happy endings. The celebration that followed the Super Bowl victory was unlike anything New Orleans had ever seen. The parade route through the city became a river of humanity, with hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets to welcome home their champions. Players who had been anonymous journeymen just a few years earlier were now treated like conquering heroes, their names chanted by crowds who understood that these men had carried not just a football team but an entire city's dreams on their shoulders. But even as the confetti was being swept from the streets, even as the championship banners were being hung in the Superdome, the seeds of the scandal that would eventually engulf the organization were already planted and growing. The bounty system that had helped fuel the team's aggressive play had not disappeared with their success. If anything, it had been validated by the results it had helped produce. The system continued to operate in the years following the Super Bowl victory, but now it carried additional weight. Players who had been part of the championship team became evangelists for the approach, convinced that their aggressive style had been a crucial factor in their success. New players who joined the team were indoctrinated into the culture, taught that earning your money meant delivering hits that opposing players would remember long after the game ended. The language around the system became more elaborate, more coded. Players would talk about pay for performance or impact bonuses, euphemisms that allowed them to discuss the system without explicitly acknowledging its more troubling aspects. Coaches would make references to getting our money's worth or ensuring that opposing players earned their paychecks, comments that sounded like standard motivational language but carried specific meaning within the team's culture. What made the system particularly dangerous was how it existed in parallel with the NFL's official policies and procedures. On paper, the Saints were following all the rules, conducting practices according to league guidelines, holding team meetings that covered appropriate topics in appropriate ways. The bounty system existed in the shadows, in the informal conversations and relationships that developed between players and coaches, in the unspoken understanding that certain behaviors would be rewarded even if they could never be officially acknowledged. The first cracks in this carefully constructed facade began to appear in 2010, when former Saints assistant coach Mike Cerullo made allegations about improper conduct within the organization. Cerullo had been fired by the Saints earlier that year, officially for poor performance but under circumstances that he believed were unfair. His allegations about the bounty system were initially dismissed by the NFL as the complaints of a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge against his former employer. But Cerullo was persistent, providing detailed accounts of how the system operated, naming specific players and coaches who had participated, describing the amounts of money involved and the types of plays that had been rewarded. His testimony painted a picture of an organization that had systematically incentivized behavior that violated both the letter and spirit of NFL rules regarding player safety. The league's initial investigation was perfunctory, the kind of routine inquiry that typically results in a finding of no wrongdoing, and a reminder to all parties about proper procedures. But as investigators dug deeper, as they interviewed more players and coaches, as they examined financial records and communication logs, a more troubling picture began to emerge. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. There were text messages between coaches discussing getting our money's worth from certain players. There were witness accounts of cash being exchanged in locker rooms after particularly impactful defensive performances. There were patterns in the Saints' defensive play that suggested their aggression was not merely the result of superior coaching and motivation, but was being specifically rewarded in ways that violated league policy. Paul Tagliabue, the NFL's former commissioner who was brought in to handle the appeals process, would later describe the bounty system as representing a culture of denial within the Saints organization. This phrase captured something essential about how the system had been allowed to operate for so long without detection. It was not simply that players and coaches were breaking rules, it was that they had created an alternative reality where those rules didn't apply, where the normal moral and ethical guidelines of professional football could be suspended in service of a greater good. The culture of denial worked on multiple levels. Players denied to themselves that what they were doing was fundamentally different from the aggressive play that was expected of them anyway. Coaches denied that they were putting players at risk by incentivizing behavior that already existed in the game. Management denied knowledge of specific details while creating an environment where such behavior could flourish. The organization as a whole denied that there was anything fundamentally wrong with the system that had contributed to the greatest period of success in franchise history. As the NFL's investigation progressed through 2011 and into 2012, the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. The league had obtained documentation of cash payments, recorded conversations between participants, and testimony from multiple sources that corroborated the existence of a systematic program to reward players for injuring opponents. The Saints' attempts to defend themselves became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. They argued that the payments were simply performance bonuses, no different from the incentive clauses that existed in many NFL contracts. They claimed that the language describing knockouts and cart-offs was simply colorful football terminology, not literal instructions to injure opposing players. They insisted that their defensive play, while aggressive, had always remained within the bounds of acceptable football conduct. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The investigation revealed that Saints players had specifically targeted opposing players' known injury vulnerabilities, that they had been rewarded for hits that resulted in opponents leaving games, that the system had been designed not just to encourage aggressive play, but to incentivize behavior that crossed the line into deliberately harmful conduct. The revelations were particularly shocking because they involved a team that had become a symbol of resilience and recovery for an entire region. The Saints were not supposed to be villains. They were supposed to be heroes, representatives of a city that had overcome disaster through determination and community spirit. The bounty scandal forced fans and observers to grapple with uncomfortable questions about the relationship between success and morality, about whether the ends could justify the means when those means involved deliberately trying to hurt other human beings. When NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell finally announced his punishment in March 2012, the severity of the sanctions reflected the league's determination to send an unmistakable message about the consequences of such behavior. Sean Payton, the coach who had led the Saints to their only Super Bowl championship, was suspended for an entire season. General Manager Mickey Loomis was suspended for 8 games. Assistant head coach Joe Vitt was suspended for 6 games. The team was fined $500,000 and forced to forfeit second-round draft picks in 2012 and 2013. The player suspensions were announced separately and were equally severe. Jonathan Vilma, identified as one of the system's ringleaders, was suspended for the entire 2012 season. Scott Fujita was suspended for 3 games. Anthony Hargrove was suspended for 8 games. Will Smith was suspended for 4 games. These were not bench players or marginal contributors. These were core members of the Saints' defense. players whose absence would fundamentally alter the team's identity and effectiveness. The announcement of these punishments sent shockwaves through New Orleans and the broader NFL community. For Saints fans, it felt like a cruel cosmic joke, as if the football gods had decided that their moment of triumph needed to be balanced with an equal measure of suffering. The team that had brought such joy to their city was now facing the possibility of returning to the mediocrity that had defined their existence before the Peyton era. The appeals process that followed was as contentious as the original investigation. The suspended players and their attorneys argued that the evidence against them was circumstantial, that the NFL had failed to prove that any specific acts of misconduct had occurred, that the entire process had been tainted by the league's desire to make an example of someone in the aftermath of growing concerns about player safety and concussion-related injuries. The legal briefs filed during the appeals process painted competing pictures of the same events. The NFL's version described a systematic program of deliberate attempts to injure opposing players, backed by financial incentives and supported by coaching staff. The players' version described aggressive but legal football played within the established culture of the sport, with any financial rewards being standard performance bonuses that had been mischaracterized by a league looking for scapegoats. The truth, as is often the case, likely existed somewhere between these extremes. The Saints had almost certainly operated a system that went beyond standard performance incentives, that specifically rewarded players for hits that resulted in opponents leaving games, that created an environment where the line between aggressive and dirty play became increasingly blurred. But it was also true that such systems were not unique to New Orleans, that similar arrangements existed in various forms throughout the league, and that the Saints were perhaps being punished as much for getting caught as for what they had actually done. Paul Tagliabue's handling of the appeals reflected this complicated reality. While he upheld most of the organizational punishments, the coaching suspensions, the fines, the lost draft picks, he overturned all of the player suspensions. His reasoning was that while the bounty system had clearly existed, the NFL had failed to prove that individual players had actually received payments for specific acts of misconduct. This split decision satisfied no one completely. The NFL felt that the player suspensions were justified and necessary to send a clear message about accountability. The Saints organization felt that any punishment was excessive given the lack of concrete evidence of actual misconduct. Saints fans felt that their team was being unfairly targeted, while similar behavior in other organizations went unpunished. The aftermath of the bounty scandal extended far beyond the specific punishments handed down by the league. The Saints, deprived of their head coach and several key defensive players, struggled through the 2012 season, finishing with a 7-9 record that felt like a return to their pre-championship mediocrity. Sean Payton, forced to watch from afar as his team stumbled through the season under interim coaches, later described the experience as the most difficult year of his professional life. But the scandal's impact went beyond wins and losses, beyond the specific individuals who were punished. It forced the NFL to confront uncomfortable questions about the culture of violence that existed within professional football, about the thin line between aggressive play and deliberately harmful conduct, about the responsibility of organizations to protect not just their own players, but their opponents as well. The timing of the bounty scandal was particularly significant because it coincided with growing awareness of the long-term effects of concussions and repetitive head trauma on NFL players. Research was beginning to reveal the devastating impact of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, on former players, studies that suggested that the violent collisions that defined professional football were causing permanent brain damage that could lead to depression, dementia, and suicide. In this context, the Saints' bounty system seemed not just unethical, but actively dangerous, a deliberate attempt to cause the kinds of injuries that were being revealed as potentially life-threatening. The scandal became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the NFL's approach to player safety, evidence that the league's commitment to protecting players was often subordinated to the pursuit of entertainment and success. The broader implications of the scandal extended to youth football and the millions of children who played the sport at various levels throughout the country. Parents who were already concerned about the safety of football found in the bounty scandal confirmation of their worst fears about the sport's culture. If professional players were being specifically rewarded for injuring opponents, what message was that sending to young athletes who looked up to NFL stars as role models? High school and college coaches found themselves having to address questions about their own programs, to reassure parents and administrators that they were not operating similar systems, that their emphasis on aggressive play did not extend to deliberately trying to hurt opposing players. The scandal forced conversations about the difference between teaching proper tackling technique and encouraging hits designed to cause injury. The legal ramifications of the bounty scandal continued to unfold for years after the initial punishments were announced. Former NFL players who believed they had been targeted by Saints defenders during the bounty period filed lawsuits against the organization, claiming that they had suffered long-term injuries as a result of deliberately dirty play. These cases were difficult to prove, requiring plaintiffs to demonstrate not just that they had been injured during games against the Saints, but that those injuries had resulted from conduct that went beyond the normal risks of playing professional football. The Saints organization, meanwhile, worked to rebuild both its on-field performance and its reputation within the league and among fans. Sean Payton's return from his suspension in 2013 was treated as a kind of homecoming, with Saints fans eager to put the scandal behind them and focus on football. The team's performance in the years following the scandal was generally strong, suggesting that their success had not been entirely dependent on the bounty system. But the scandal left permanent scars on the organization and the individuals involved. Players who had been suspended found that their reputations had been permanently altered, that they would always be remembered as much for their participation in the bounty system as for their contributions to the Saints' championship. Coaches who had been involved in the program discovered that their career prospects had been diminished, that other organizations were reluctant to hire individuals associated with the scandal. For the city of New Orleans, the bounty scandal represented a particularly cruel twist in the ongoing narrative of recovery and resilience. The Saints' Super Bowl victory had been embraced as a proof that the city could overcome any obstacle, that determination and community spirit could triumph over adversity. The revelation that this success had been achieved, at least in part, through systematically trying to injure opposing players, tainted what had seemed like a pure moment of triumph. The scandal forced New Orleans to grapple with uncomfortable questions about the price of success, about whether the ends could justify the means when those means involved deliberately harmful conduct. It challenged the narrative of noble struggle and righteous victory that had grown up around the Saints' championship, replacing it with a more complex and morally ambiguous story about the compromises that people and organizations make in pursuit of their goals. Years later, as the immediate impact of the scandal faded and the Saints continued to compete at a high level under Sean Payton's leadership, the bounty controversy settled into its place in NFL history as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing competitive drive to override ethical considerations. It became a reminder that in a sport defined by controlled violence, the line between acceptable aggression and unacceptable conduct must be carefully maintained and rigorously enforced. The scandal also highlighted the importance of institutional culture in shaping individual behavior. The Saints' bounty system had not emerged spontaneously. It had been cultivated over time, normalized through repetition and reinforcement, until behavior that would have seemed shocking in isolation came to seem routine and acceptable. This process of normalization, where gradually escalating conduct becomes embedded in an organization's culture, is not unique to football or even to sports. It is a pattern that appears in various forms throughout human institutions. The legacy of the Saints' bounty scandal extends beyond the specific punishments and consequences that followed its revelation. It serves as a case study in how organizational culture can drift from accepted norms, how competitive pressure can distort ethical judgment, and how the pursuit of success can lead individuals and institutions to compromise their values in ways they might never have imagined possible. For current and future NFL players, coaches, and executives, the scandal serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining clear ethical boundaries, even in the heat of competition. It demonstrates that the culture of an organization is not just about what is explicitly taught or officially sanctioned, but about what is tolerated, encouraged, and rewarded through informal channels and unspoken understandings. The Saints' story, both their triumphant rise to championship glory and their fall into scandal, reflects broader themes about success and morality, about the prices we are willing to pay for achievement, and about the responsibility that comes with representing something larger than ourselves. In choosing to celebrate their championship, while also acknowledging the troubling aspects of how it was achieved, New Orleans and its football fans have grappled with the kind of moral complexity that exists in most human endeavors, but is often overlooked in the simplified narratives we tell about sports. The bounty scandal reminds us that heroes are human, that success comes with costs that are not always immediately visible, and that the line between competitive drive and harmful conduct must be consciously and carefully maintained. It is a story about the shadows that exist behind even the brightest moments, about the complex relationship between noble goals and questionable methods, and about the ongoing challenge of maintaining integrity while pursuing excellence in a world that often seems to reward those who are willing to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. As the years pass and new scandals capture public attention, the Saints' bounty controversy may fade from immediate memory. But its lessons about organizational culture, ethical decision-making, and the responsibility that comes with influence and success remain relevant not just for professional sports, but for any institution where competitive pressure and the pursuit of achievement create environments where moral compromise becomes a temptation. The weight of gold, as the Saints learned, is heavier than it appears. Victory carries with it not just the joy of achievement, but the responsibility of how that achievement was earned. In the end, the true measure of success may not be found in championships won or records broken, but in the methods used to achieve those goals and the legacy left behind for future generations to examine and learn from. In New Orleans, where the Mississippi River carries the sediment of a continent toward the sea, where jazz emerged from the collision of cultures and traditions, where Mardi Gras masks both conceal and reveal truth, the story of the Saints' bounty scandal has become part of the city's complex narrative about resilience, achievement, and the prices we pay for both. It is a story that reminds us that every triumph casts a shadow, every victory carries a cost, and every hero must eventually face the consequences of the choices made in pursuit of glory. The bounty scandal may have ended the innocence that surrounded the Saints' championship, but it has not erased the genuine joy that victory brought to a city that desperately needed reasons to celebrate. Instead, it has added another layer to New Orleans's understanding of itself, another chapter in the ongoing story of a place that continues to find ways to endure, to achieve, and to learn from both its triumphs and its failures. And so the story continues, carried forward like everything else in New Orleans by the current of the great river, moving toward destinations unknown, carrying with it the sediment of memory and the hope that future generations will find ways to achieve greatness without compromising the values that make greatness meaningful. The weight of gold, the Saints learned, is not just in its mass but in its meaning, not just in its gleam but in the shadows it casts, not just in its value but in the price paid to possess it.